Welcome back for part 2 of our series on everything you need to know about video codecs. We have a lot to get into for part 2, so let's just get right into it. We last left off with the idea of complexity in a codec, establishing that some codecs are easier to play back than others. One reason that we left off on is the difference between intra and inter-frame coding. Inter needs to essentially reconstruct frames and sequences, and so we can consider that more complex. And trust me, you can get really granular with this. There are multiple levels of complexity for most codecs that we don't have time to get into, but they basically boil down to making your videos more compressible at the same bitrate and to support higher end video specs. Newer codecs can use more advanced complex techniques in their compression, which is why HEVC, for example, generally looks better than H.264 at the same bitrate. But there's other ways that videos can become more complex too, and codec complexity has an impact on something called hardware compatibility. So what we're going to do this time is explain some of the more advanced topics you should know when choosing a codec, and then go through examples of the decision-making process in a camera. What do I mean when I say hardware compatibility? Well, compressed videos need to be decoded for playback, and decoding can be done basically one of two ways. By something general purpose, like a CPU in your computer, or by a dedicated piece of hardware whose sole function is to decode video. This is what's called hardware decoding or hardware playback. The same is true for encoding or exporting your video. You can do it in software, or you can do it on a dedicated piece of hardware. Typically on a computer, whether that be a desktop or laptop, this is part of the GPU, your graphics card. But for computers that have integrated graphics, they too will often have hardware video support, and this is crucial for editing and delivery. You see, hardware compatibility has two main advantages. It draws much less power than a CPU to do the job, and it's extremely fast. And when I say fast, I mean the same video that could take an hour to encode on a CPU could potentially take just minutes on a hardware encoder. Technically, your camera has dedicated hardware to compress video as it records to its media. Your phone has dedicated hardware to record videos and compress them for social media. Phones also use dedicated hardware decoders because they drain the battery far less when watching YouTube. You can get into the weeds with this, but this ultimately brings us right back to the question of how do you choose the right codec? Well, let's break down what hardware compatibility means in practice. Ever notice that different codecs from different cameras seem to play faster than others? It's easy to understand, for example, that lower resolution video will generally play back faster than something higher resolution. But what about when you dive through your camera settings and you see things like this? XAVC-S and XAVC-HS for Sony cameras. XF-AVC and XF-HEVC or HEVC-S for Canon cameras. 422 and 420, 8-bit and 10-bit, MP4, MXF, and MOV. Some cameras, such as those from Panasonic, offer a list of every possible combination of features, while other cameras only offer certain features or options with certain containers or codec varieties. For the first two options, those refer to codecs. Canon's case, for example, is pretty easy to understand. XF-AVC refers to the H.264 codec being used. AVC is the same as H.264, while XF-HEVC refers to, you guessed it, HEVC. This is the first important choice for hardware compatibility. Most graphics cards can decode H.264, but not every variety of it. I'll explain in a sec. In the last 5 years or so, most graphics cards have also been able to decode HEVC, but again, not every variety of it. The features of the codec determine what kind of hardware support it has. Now, most of these details are considerations for editing, making sure your computer can play back the footage smoothly and cut fast. But hardware compatibility impacts delivery too. Hardware encoding is a powerful tool when exporting video, but again, the options you have largely depend on your hardware, and in some cases, hardware encoding might not have the same visual quality as a software encode, so you have to weigh your options here. Before we continue, let's skip to the fifth option in the list. I explained in part 1 the difference between containers and codecs, but what's important to know is how your camera lays these container options out. Some cameras only allow you to record in certain formats with certain containers, like Canon's XF-AVC on the C70, which defaults to MXF. Others will give you the option to use MP4 or MOV somewhat interchangeably. This is on a very camera-by-camera basis, so do check your camera's options. Okay, so let's look at the third option in that list then. 422 and 420, or 420 as I usually say. What do these mean? These numbers refer to something called chroma subsampling. Chroma subsampling is a very dense subject in itself, so I'll give you the simplified version. Video starts as RGB, red, green, and blue color channels, but most video is not actually stored this way. After the image is captured, the video is first converted to a black and white luma or brightness channel, and the red and blue difference channels, often called chroma or color channels. This method of color encoding is called YCBCR and is frequently abbreviated to YCC, which you will often see on Canon menus, for example. But why do this conversion at all? And what do the numbers mean still? Well, to save space, it's always about that, YCC takes advantage of the fact that human vision is more sensitive to light than color. Thus, the resolution of the color or chroma channels can be lower than the light or luma channel. Let's visualize this in a 4x2 grid of pixels. Full resolution light and color is called 444. You see this as an option in ProRes, for example. This means that every pixel in this grid gets full resolution in all channels. Every pixel is unique here. 422 means that the luma channel remains at full resolution, hence the first 4 in the name, while the 2 chroma channels are halved in resolution horizontally, only providing every other color pixel in a given row. This is where the first 2 comes in the name. The vertical resolution does remain full, however, but because the pixels are duplicated across, you get the final 2 in the name. So 422 color is considered to be half the resolution of the luma. For the majority of video out there, what you're looking at is actually, most commonly, a 420 image. 4 again meaning full resolution luma, 2 meaning half resolution horizontally, but 0 meaning nothing vertically. In practice, what happens is that the top row of pixels in our example gets copied to the bottom row. And what this effectively means is that the chroma resolution is quarter of the luma. Now, that's a lot to digest, but how does that impact you? For one, 422 color is more detailed and can result in more subtle color gradations and an overall sharper image as compared to 420. It's especially useful for visual effects work such as chroma keys, and it does let you push color grades a little bit further. But I'd argue it's not the most important factor in a grade. Broadcasters often require a 422 deliverable, meaning the footage should be shot in 422. They'll often provide specific minimums for how much footage can be of a lesser quality. But there's a reason why people historically flocked to broadcast ENG cameras, for example, and why these days only some cameras are Netflix certified. And as for hardware compatibility, certain video cards will not play back 422 variants of certain codecs. This is where you need to check what your graphics card can support, and thus what codec might be the better option for you in your camera. In general, 420 can still look great. All video streaming and even high-end disc formats like UHD Blu-ray use 420, so trust me when I say that the majority of video you see is 420 for a reason. It does work, but do know the limitations and requirements for your project. So, about that last number, 8-bit and 10-bit. A few years ago, we did a whole video explaining what these numbers mean and the differences. I highly recommend you check it out if you want a better understanding of the differences and the details, but I'll give you the summary here. Bit depth is all about how many different shades of color you can have in a video. 8-bit means you have 256 shades per channel, and for the 3 RGB channels, or yes, YCC, that means a total of 16,777,216 possible colors. Now that might sound like a lot of color, but it depends on your color space. Most video you see every day in use is either Rec. 709 for TV displays or sRGB for phones and computers. 8-bit video is just enough to smoothly render these color spaces, but you still can sometimes see things like banding in your image if you shoot your footage in 8-bit, which is brought out even more if you try to grade that footage. 10-bit color means you have 1,024 shades of color for a total of 1,073,741,824 colors. This means a few things. The colors you capture will have smoother gradients, especially in colors like skies, shadows, and light flares. You have more room to grade your image in post because of all the extra information provided by the additional bits, and this is crucial when shooting in log color profiles. Some cameras won't even allow you to record log in 8 bits for this very reason. Remember, 8-bit is mostly acceptable for Rec. 709, but color spaces such as P3 and Rec 2020 allow for more vibrant color to be captured and displayed, which means you need more bits to get the job done. And once you start talking about HDR, you're actually required to use 10 bits at a minimum. Some high-end cinema cameras can record up to 16-bit color, and the resulting files are enormous, but they are gorgeous, and they can be manipulated in a way that gives you unparalleled flexibility in the grade. Now, as far as codecs are concerned, 8-bit, 10-bit, and even 12-bit recording really comes down to a few considerations. Are you shooting for quick delivery to the web with little to no color grading? You better nail your exposure, get your white balance just right, stick to a standard color profile, and then you should mostly be okay. H.264 8-bit video in particular will also play back on pretty much every device. You can pop an SD card out of a camera and into a TV or smartphone, and it'll probably play back. However, if you're delivering for broadcast, you are often required to shoot and deliver in 10 bits, as I've said countless times already, even if you're not looking to grade the image. An interesting thing about bit depth is that codecs themselves just work better at higher bit depths, especially in dark, noisy areas of the frame. The exact reason for this is somewhat complicated, but basically, when the codec is throwing away information, it rounds off and estimates what the image will be, and it does that within an 8-bit value. This is what leads to banding. In 10-bit mode though, that information is rounded off within 10-bit values. So the change from this process is smaller as it's across a greater range. So instead of rounding numbers between 256 shades, it can do so within 1024. Lastly, hardware compatibility means that older GPUs might not play back certain codecs in a 10-bit mode. One example of this is H.264 recorded in 10-bit 422 color, which you can find on many cameras. It's actually more common to find GPUs that can decode HEVC in 10-bit 422, and so even though HEVC is newer and more complex overall, it might end up being the faster option for you in the edit. These days, many more cameras can record in 10-bit modes, and I personally recommend shooting everything in them at all times, unless you're aiming for the absolute fastest editing and delivery. So here we are. We've gone over the essential details that you need to know when choosing codecs for shooting, editing, and delivery. So how can we put that into practice? Well, let's go over some common choices. As I've said a bunch of times now, H.264 in 8-bit 420 is currently the most ubiquitous format, and it's playable on pretty much everything, but I wouldn't recommend shooting in it these days. For quick delivery and casual shooting, it's a good choice due to how easy it is to play back, but for anyone looking to color grade or has to deliver to professional outlets, it should be avoided, honestly. And really, most cameras these days that can shoot in 10-bit mode offer some form of 8-bit proxy recording, so if you need that quick deliverable for a client, you can just hand them that version. Next up would be H.264 in its 10-bit 420 and 422 varieties. This includes formats like Canon's XF-AVC, which can record in either a long op or intra mode, but it's pretty uncommon to find 10-bit H.264 supported in hardware, meaning your computer will have to work harder to decode it in software. Moving on to the more modern HEVC, it's rarely seen in 8-bit, though it does exist. You're much more likely to see it as a 10-bit option in either 422 or 420. Because it's newer and is the codec of choice for most HDR content, it happens to be a well-supported option for hardware compatibility, at least in 10-bit 420. 10-bit 422 is less common, but Apple M series chips and Intel's Arc graphics cards are examples of platforms that can decode it. So I'll show you an example after this of where that decision can come up. Quality is generally better than H.264 at the same bit rates, but some cameras only offer a lower bitrate HEVC option compared to the higher bitrate H.264 option, so the quality might end up being similar in practice. These days, I recommend shooting HEVC 10-bit 422 if possible, and using a proxy setup if you can't decode them fast enough. Which brings me to the final point. We didn't talk about them much, but Apple ProRes and Avid DNX codecs are especially popular because they're intra-coded, usually 10-bit 422, and they're relatively simple in design, so they're naturally fast to decode, even in software. Plus, on Apple M series chips at least, ProRes is hardware accelerated, making it even faster. The only real downside is the size. Some cameras can record straight to ProRes or with the help of an external recorder, and it is a great option if you have the storage for it. However, ProRes and DNX proxy files are a very popular way to deal with lack of hardware compatibility or with a slower computer without taking up too much extra space. Before we wrap this up, I want to share one real-world example with you on how you would choose your codec. So cameras these days can often record in multiple codecs. The Canon C80s we have here, for example, can record to both H.264 and HEVC, but some cameras, like the Panasonic S1R2, for example, can also record to ProRes internally. In part 1, I brought up the concept of this triangle of codec options, so let's show how that lines up here. First, while we publish primarily to the web, we do like to take a 4K broadcast style approach to our productions. We shoot everything in log color to be graded later, which means we pretty much automatically want a 10-bit 422 codec. 10-bit 422 versions of codecs are usually more complex to decode, right? We just established this a few minutes ago. Now, on the C80, we have two codecs that can support this, H.264 and HEVC, or as Canon has named them, XF-AVC and XF-HEVC-S, respectively. HEVC, being the newer codec, is more complex, and shooting in 4K at 24 FPS sets the camera to 135 megabits per second. The camera only supports long op here in this mode, so it's also more complex. Now, the H.264 option with the same settings turns out to shoot at 150 megabits per second, so you can see how the bitrate is adjusted for the older codec. In the end though, the quality might end up being roughly the same between the two, but we're not going to get into that here. The point is, why choose H.264 here? Could it be easier to decode for our editors than HEVC? Maybe. If you recall, HEVC tends to have more hardware support out there for 10-bit 422 video, and much more support for 10-bit 420. So if you have a recent NVIDIA or Intel GPU, or an Apple M chip, you'd probably benefit from going with HEVC here. If, however, your computer doesn't have hardware decoding support for these formats, we might go with H.264, because in that case, both formats would be decoded in software, and a computer would probably have a much harder time with HEVC. We have M2 Max Studios here, so these days I'm going to go with HEVC because we can cut it natively. So does that make some sense? Trust me, every one of these topics could be its own video, and the real engineering details of these concepts are both dry and fascinating, depending on who you are. But for most of us, these are the essentials you need to know to make an informed decision when shooting, editing, and delivering your videos. As always, consider the needs of your production. Let us know in the comments below if this video helped you learn at least a little bit more about video codecs. Maybe we demystified something along the way. I certainly hope so. I'm Doug with B&H, and I'll see you next time.